thank you again, Sharon and Joan. Thank you for being our pinch hitter or whatever. I've said it over and over again. That's one thing that I really love about us as a group. We all jump in when we need help, and we all need help. So it's just, I thank every one of you for your willingness to help out when we need it, however that may be. And some of you are in behind the scenes helping out, and you don't get noticed, but I want you to know that help is just as important as any help that's done up here. So thank you all. The past couple times I spoke, including last week, we were in Nehemiah 1. We looked at the prayer of Nehemiah. And I want to stay in Nehemiah, so today we're going to be looking at the chapter 2 of Nehemiah. But before I start, I want to ask this question. What could God do in our church or in our lives in this day and age to reach a new generation with the gospel? To gather Christians around, or to gather us as a church together, Christians around, and we're seeing that next weekend. There's Christians from every denomination gathering. What can we do to reach those around us? Let's just pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you again for this opportunity to speak, and Lord, more than that, I thank you for the opportunity to hear your word. Lord, I just pray that this would be a fitting message for each and every one of us, and every one of us could walk away with just something from you, Lord. Pray for your wisdom and your guidance as I speak, and I pray that it would be your words and not my words, I ask in Jesus' name. Amen. I left my bulletin down there, but it's okay. But on that bulletin, there was the primary verse that I want to look at. Well, maybe I brought it. I thought it doesn't matter. Was verse 18 of chapter 2. But what we're going to do is I want to just read this complete chapter, and then we'll just kind of go through it step by step. But as we're reading, just take particular note of verse 18. Excuse me. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of the heart." So I became dreadfully afraid, and I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad, when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire?" And the king said to me, "What do you regret? What do you request?" So I prayed to God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, and the queen also was sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be? And when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Furthermore, I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the regions beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy." And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon him. Then I went to the governors in the region beyond the river, gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Nor was there any animal with me except the one on which I rode. And I went out by night throughout the valley gate to the serpent well and to the refuse gate, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem which were broken down, and its gates which were burned with fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went up in the night by the valley and viewed the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. Then I said to them, "You see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach." Now pay attention to this. And I told them the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also the king's words which he had spoken to me. So they said, "Let us rise up and build." Then they set their hands to this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, "What is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king?" So I answered them and said to them, "The God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will rise and build. But you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem." Wow. Verse 18. Then they set their hands to this good work. Good work. That little phrase, the good work. I want you to think of two things when you think of good work. It's an awesome work. It was a big challenge, but it was something that God had called them to, and it was great. But the other thing about that good work is it was hard work. It was an awesome task, but it was also going to be a hard task. Which means we need the hand of my God in order to do it. So good work, and I want you to think about the gospel. And when you hear the gospel, we know it's the good news. So good work, gospel, good news. Our mission is, and this is what we exist as Christians, is to spread the gospel. The good news. And this is good work. But it's not easy work. It's hard work. I heard some stats this week that were very disturbing, not kind of disturbing, they were disturbing. 70% of youth in a church will walk away after graduation. That's 70% of kids turning away from Jesus by the time they get to university. Yes.
Okay, I was just going to ask if it's university, right?
By the time they get to university. So, just to put that in perspective, I counted as the kids went to Sunday school. There were 7 kids that went to Sunday school. Likelihood, only 1.5 of them are still going to be in church by the time they hit university. I don't know which half is going to be the half, but you get what my point is. 7 of those kids will not be sitting in this church or any church in another 10 years. And if you don't think that's broken down walls, That's broken down walls. And I look at that, and that's a good work. That's an awesome work to raise these kids. Parents especially, I'm talking to you, but I'm talking to all of us. It's all of our responsibility. Anytime we have a baby dedication, I think of the last baby dedication we had. That baby is now halfway around the world, I think, or are they on their way back there? No, okay. Halfway around the world. But we as a church all sat here and said that we would pray for that kid and help pray for his parents as he gets raised, so that he would be in church in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years, in the years to come, so that he could raise his kids. It is all of our responsibility in the church, not just our own. Anyway, I digress, I think. But my point is, it's hard work. I mean, it's an awesome responsibility, but this is hard work. And then I think further, it's not just the next generation that we have to worry about, but it's the nations around us. Now more than ever in history, we see every tribe and every nation right outside these doors. We don't even have to go anywhere to be missionaries. They're coming to us. But let's expand it a little bit. We don't have to go anywhere, but there is a world out there. And there's approximately 3.2 billion people that have never heard the gospel. They have no means of getting the gospel. There's not a local church or even a church within walking distance or a believer within earshot of them. There's no one there that can give them the good news. And again, it's awesome news, but it's hard work to get that news to them. And we think about it, we think, what were Jesus' last words before his ascension? In Mark 16:15, he said, "Go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature." And this was his command. To the nations here, but also to the nations far from here. And this is an awesome work. But it's a hard work that God has called us to do. And here's the problem. If we are not careful, we can think about this good work to reach the next generation, to reach those outside these walls, to reach the 3.2 billion people around this world who have never heard the gospel. And we can think about that. And we can be so overwhelmed by it that we don't do anything at all. It's so easy to think, I've got so much going on in my life. What can I really do about this good work? You can suddenly, almost unknowingly, buy into the lie that says, since I can't do everything, I can't do anything. But that's what's great about this story of Nehemiah. It's about one man who looked in the face of a massive, massive need. Broken walls, burning gates, hard work. The hard work it was going to take to rebuild this city. And he said, I'm not going to ignore this work. I'm not going to excuse myself from this work. No, I'm going to do something about it. Now don't miss this. Nehemiah wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a pastor. He wasn't really even a person of influence. He was just your local guy in the city square. He was just a regular guy who decided, I have a role to play in the good work God wants to do in my day. And that's what my prayer is for all of you. And that's my prayer for myself too. That we together would decide that we have a role to play in this good work. God has called us to do this work together. He has promised His good hand to anyone who does it. And I want to challenge you by the Spirit of God that's residing inside of each and every believer to do your part. I also want to acknowledge that I know some, if not most, of you are carrying great burdens in your hearts and in your life right now. You are walking through a variety of difficulties. And I just want to say, I'm with you. We all are. There's a prayer meeting on Wednesday nights, and I haven't been going, but I had the fortunate opportunity of listening. And I'm telling you, there's people praying for you. For each one of you here, at different times, there's people praying. So you're not alone. And I want you to remember this. It's by God's grace that each one of us are carrying those loads with the gospel in our lives, with the hope of Jesus in our hearts. And we are talking about a generation and nations around us who are carrying the same burdens, who have no hope and no gospel. So by God's grace, let's press into this gospel of hope with all of our hearts, and let's spread this gospel of hope to the world full of people within our hearts that can only be healed by Jesus. And I want to show you 7 steps Nehemiah took to accomplish this great work that God was calling him. The first 2 steps we already covered the last couple times I spoke. Pray, that's the first step, and fasting, that was the second step. Chapter 1, Nehemiah heard about the need of the walls being rebuilt around Jerusalem, but he was hundreds of miles away in a palace working with the king's cupbearer. So what did he do? He started praying and he started fasting. Now Nehemiah 1:1 started in the month of Chislev. That's when Nehemiah first heard. That's when Nehemiah first heard the need in Jerusalem. So he started to pray and he started to fast. Now in Nehemiah 2 that we just read, we find now that we're in the month of Nisan. Now from Chislev to Nisan was about 4 months. So for 4 months, Nehemiah prayed and he fasted. Now that doesn't mean that he didn't eat or he didn't drink. But what it does mean is for 4 months, Nehemiah was continually in prayer and fasting for God, or to God, asking, what's my role? How can we get this dealt with? You may remember when I first started talking about this, I said that really this Nehemiah is kind of stuck in between Ezra and Esther, and really it's one book. It's just got 3 main characters in it. And it's interesting to think that if you look at, if we look at Ezra, the book prior, Ezra did this exact same thing. Before he led God's people back to Jerusalem, he declared a fast to pray for protection. And then right after, we get to Nehemiah, he fasts and prays. And what does Esther do? Esther did the same thing before she went before the king, right? She called all her people. She said, pray and fast for 3 days before I bring the message to the king. So we have 3 stories back to back to back of people who attempted to do a great work. And all of them started with prayer and fasting. They were not about to try this good, hard, awesome work without first setting aside food and praying for God's help. So that leads to step number 3. Nehemiah plans. At some point during his praying and fasting, he realizes, I can do something about this. Have you ever been praying for something and God says, I'm going to answer that prayer through you? And you say, whoa, 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 that's not what I was praying. And God says, yes. And you are the answer to that prayer. So Nehemiah starts planning. He knows he has an audience with the king, but he also knows he can't just come outright say to the king, like, I'd like to have a long vacation. Can I just kind of do my own thing for the next while? And keep in mind, this is the same king who decreed that a temple shouldn't even be built there in this city. So Nehemiah had to come up with a plan. He had to come up with a plan first just to get the king to initiate a conversation with him. Nehemiah was a cupbearer, not a royal advisor. He didn't get to just walk into the king and say, I got plans here. He knew it was forbidden for the cupbearer to be sad in the king's presence, which means he would be risking his job and more than likely even risking his life. But Nehemiah couldn't think of any other way. This was his plan A. And there was no option for a plan B. If plan A didn't work, he wouldn't be around for a plan B. And we'll see later in the chapter that he keeps planning. Again, after he gets to Jerusalem, he takes a journey around the walls and to see the situation, comes up with a plan. So up to now, we see Nehemiah praying, and we see him fasting, and now we see him planning. So he's wisely thinking through what part is God calling me to do. Now Nehemiah doesn't stop there though. At this point, Nehemiah has to take the next step, or more likely, the next leap. Step 4, risk. Look how it starts in verse 1 of chapter 2. It says, now I've never been sad in his presence before, because he knew there was risk of being sad. Until one day he decides to take the risk. He walks in with his head down, and the king asks in verse 2, why is your head down? Why is your face sad? And this was the moment where Nehemiah could lose his job or his life. And we do know the weight of the situation, because Nehemiah says in verse 2, I became very afraid, or dreadfully afraid. Dreadfully afraid. But the king opened up the option that he just opened it up a little bit for that little bit of risk. So he decides, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to push in with the risk. In verse 3, he says, and I said to the king, may the king live forever. And that's maybe not a bad idea. Butter up whoever you're talking to before you decide that you're taking the risk. Why should my face be sad? Why should my face not be sad? When the city and the palace of my father's tombs lies waste and its gates are burned up with fire. But he goes on in verse 4 and says, and the king said to me, what do you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, and this is where risk goes up even just one more notch. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So not only did he take the risk by looking sad, now he's taking the risk by asking for that holiday I was talking about. Anyone who has ever taken that leap of faith knows how he must have been feeling at this point in time. You know that, oh God, help me. And it goes on in verse 5. Oh, sorry. I gotta pay better close. Oh, yeah, so he went on in verse 5 and he said, if it pleases the king, and then he asked about the journey. And what does he do then? That waiting. He just waits for an answer from the king. And it doesn't say how long he was waiting, but I imagine it was excruciating, that silence while he was waiting for an answer. He's probably checking his neck to see if the head was still going to be attached. And as he looks at the king and the queen sitting right there beside, finally the silence broke when the king asks in verse 6, how long will your journey be? So the rewards of the risk have just been answered by a resounding yes. How long will you be, and when will you return? So now Nehemiah's feeling pretty good. He took the risk and he got the answer he wanted. And now that he's feeling good, he thinks, you know what? Let's just see how far we can go with this. So in verse 7 and 8, furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make the beams for the gates of the citadel that pertains to the temple, for a city wall. And notice this, even for a house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. I can just kind of picture it in my head. He asked for a holiday, and then he says to the king, you know what, I'm going to be gone for a while, so can you also build me my own house there? But as he asked for safe travel, for supplies, and he even asked for this house, the king says, you got it. And not only what he asked for, but he got a whole lot more. Because if you look at verse 9, then it says, then I went to the governors of the region beyond the river, and gave them the king's letter. Now the king had sent the captains of the army and horsemen with me. I mean, he just wanted letters so that he could get where he was going. But the king even gave him an army to escort him there. So, we've seen up to this point, Nehemiah prayed, he fasted, he planned, he took a great risk, and what we saw was God moved on his behalf. In verse 8, and the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. God's good hand provided more than Nehemiah could have ever imagined. Which leads us now to step 5, work. Those first 4 steps just seemed hard and risky. But they just introduced a lot more steps that needed to come. Because now Nehemiah had to travel to Jerusalem with all kinds of challenges along the way. And when he gets there, he begins the hard work of getting supplies together, bringing workers and leaders together. And he had to convince these people that they're going to be working day and night. It was a lot of work. And none of it would be easy. And most of it would be monotonous and tiresome. Long gone were the days for Nehemiah, where he was living a comfortable life in the palace. Now he's in Jerusalem, trying to pull together a discouraged people and motivate them to do hard work of rebuilding a massive wall. And if that weren't enough, this work would be complicated by opposition. And we see this in verse 10. In verse 10, we're introduced to Sanballat and Tobiah. And then later in verse 19, we're also going to see the heir of Geshem. And these guys, as hard as Nehemiah is working to rebuild these walls, these guys are working just as hard to tear Nehemiah down and destroy God's people. Which leads us to step number 6, perseverance. From the moment Nehemiah arrives at Jerusalem, people are actively working to oppose the work he is doing. By verse 19, these 3 guys are laughing and despising Nehemiah. They are making accusations of rebellion against the king. Never mind the fact that there was no foundations for these accusations. In fact, Nehemiah had the letters from the king and the support of the king. But this is what people do when they can't find anything against you. They resort to slander, false accusations, or whatever they can do to turn people against you. To turn people against you and the work that you are trying to do. Yet, we see Nehemiah perseveres in the midst of great opposition. I want you to notice something in verse 18. I told them the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also the king's words which he had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. And they set their hands to this good work. Let us rise up and build. And this comes up again in verse 20. His servants will arise and build. Knowing that there would be opposition, Nehemiah is saying, we will do this good work God has called us to, knowing there will be opposition from this world. So, when you're doing a good work, don't be surprised when opposition comes. When you are doing God's work, remember to rise up and build. So, we have pray, fast, plan, work, persevere. I'm running out of fingers. Persevere. And step 7, trust God. It's awesome to look at this. And at every point, Nehemiah is trusting God and not himself. We see how he prayed, Lord God of heaven, and remember how I said I was acknowledging God as his dad or as his father. But when he set up heaven, he was also acknowledging this was the sovereign God who had control of absolutely everything. And we see that he had a well thought out plan. He showed risk and asked the king's favor to see what Nehemiah said. Or he asked for the king's favor. But look at what Nehemiah says in verse 8. According to the good hand of God upon me. He wasn't saying because I'm great at my job or I've got a really good speech. No, the reason he succeeded and he acknowledged it was the good hand of God upon me. And then in verse 12, we see it again. I told no one what God had put in my heart. And again in verse 18, the hand of my God which had been good upon me, as he was rallying the people together, instead of pointing out himself or pointing out a plan or pointing out anything, he's pointing out the good hand of God upon him. And I think it's so fitting that this chapter ends at verse 20, or ends in verse 20 where it says, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. We see it all throughout this chapter in Nehemiah, that he's trusting God's good hand for this great work. Now, as I wrap it up, I just want you to think about ourselves in the light of this world and the opposition around us. How can we ask what we can do? Are we asking what we can do, or are we asking what can God do through us? So we need to pray, and we need to fast. We need to plan. We know that when we plan, there's going to be risk. There's going to be hard work. It's an awesome work, but it's going to be hard work. And when resistance comes, we need to persevere. But more than anything, if we follow those first 6 steps, we need to know that we can trust in God's good hand.